Every religion ever built by human hands rests on one promise: the gods cannot die. Egyptian gods, Ra, Osiris, Horus, eternal. Beyond death, beyond time, beyond the reach of anything the mortal world could produce. Greek gods, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, immortal. Wounded sometimes. Humiliated occasionally, but never truly at risk. Never genuinely mortal. Roman gods. Hindu gods. The God of Abraham. The Buddha beyond suffering. Every tradition, every culture, immortal gods. Except one, the Norse. The Vikings built their entire religious universe around gods who were going to die. Not might die, not could theoretically die under impossible circumstances. Were going to die. On a specific day, in specific ways. Odin, the All-Father, the Lord of Valhalla and wisdom and war, knew that at the end he would be swallowed whole by Fenrir the wolf. Thor, the strongest of the gods, the hammer-wielding warrior, knew that at Ragnarök he would kill the Midgard Serpent and die from its venom. 14 steps. He would walk 14 steps after the killing blow before the poison dropped him. Fenrir had already given away his magical sword. At Ragnarök, weaponless, he would fall to Surtur the fire giant. He knew it. The gods of the Vikings were not immortal. They were brave. That distinction, the gap between immortal and brave, contains one of the most sophisticated psychological insights any ancient culture ever encoded. This is the story of what the Norse understood about death that the rest of the ancient world was not willing to face. To understand why the Norse built mortal gods, you need to understand the world that built the Norse. Scandinavia in the Viking Age was not a world that allowed comfortable illusions. The sea killed people, not occasionally, not dramatically once a generation, regularly, persistently, across every family and every coastal community across Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden. Fathers who went to sea and did not come back. Brothers, sons, husbands. The ocean was not a background element of Norse life. It was the central fact of it, and the ocean was completely indifferent. It did not care about prayers. It did not respond to virtue or valor or the quality of a man's character. The storm that capsized a longship full of experienced sailors did not distinguish between the honorable and the dishonorable, the brave and the cowardly, the faithful and the faithless. It just killed. Then there was the winter. 6 months of darkness, cold, and the constant arithmetic of survival. How much food was left? How many weeks until spring? Whether the calculation worked out. Sometimes it did not work out. Children died in Norse winters. Elderly people died. Animals died and took the food supply with them. Entire farms failed. Entire communities that had done everything right, had followed every practice passed down from previous generations, failed anyway. Because the world was not calibrated to reward preparation. It was calibrated to function according to its own rules, and those rules included outcomes that were simply not fair. A culture shaped by this reality could not build a religion based on the premise that the universe was fundamentally just, because the universe they lived in was demonstrably not fundamentally just. It was powerful. It was consistent in its physical laws. It was, in certain specific ways, readable and navigable, but it was not just, and a religion that told people the universe was just would have been immediately falsified by the daily experience of anyone trying to survive. So the Norse built something different. They built gods who lived in the same unjust universe they did. Gods who faced the same fundamental problem every Norse person faced every day. Ragnarök. The word means the doom of the gods, the twilight of the gods, the final battle at the end of the world. Most people know Ragnarök as the Norse apocalypse, the end of everything, the destruction of the world. And that is accurate, but it is half the story. The half that changes everything about what Ragnarök actually means is this. The gods know it is coming, not vaguely, not as a distant theological possibility. Precisely, in detail. Odin spent millennia gathering information, sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom, to see more clearly what was coming. hung himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days without food or water to gain the knowledge of the runes, consulted the Völva, the seeress, who told him everything she saw in the future in the poem Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress. He knew who would fight and who would fall. He knew his own death, the wolf Fenrir swallowing him. He knew his son Vidar would avenge him. Knowing all of this, Odin prepared for a battle he knew he was going to lose. Valhalla, the great hall of the honored dead, was not built because Odin wanted a palace. It was built as a training ground. The Einherjar fought each day and feasted each night specifically to prepare for Ragnarök, to build an army for the final battle. And lose. Because Odin knew they would lose. He knew the Norse gods would fall. He knew humanity's world would be destroyed. He knew the forces against the gods, Fenrir, the Midgard Serpent, Surtur, Loki, were stronger than what the gods could assemble. He knew this. And he built the army anyway. He gathered the warriors anyway. He prepared anyway. If you know you are going to lose, if you know the battle ends in your death, if you know that preparation, courage, strength, and strategy will not be enough, do you still fight? The Norse answer was yes, not because fighting would change the outcome, because the fighting was the point. The theological framework of Norse mythology is built on a concept that has no clean translation in English. The closest approximation is doing what is right regardless of outcome, not because the outcome will be good, not because virtue is rewarded, not because the universe will recognize and compensate correct action, but because correct action is its own justification. The Norse gods fight at Ragnarök, knowing they will lose because fighting is what is required of them. Because to not fight, to surrender, to accept the outcome without resistance, to let the wolf swallow the world without opposition, would be wrong regardless of success. The rightness of the action is independent of its result. This is a philosophically sophisticated position, sophisticated enough that modern existential philosophy, particularly the work of Albert Camus, arrives at essentially the same place from a completely different direction. Camus' Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, must be imagined happy, not because the task is meaningful in any external sense, but because the act of doing it, consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of its futility, is itself an act of defiance against meaninglessness. Odin knew Ragnarök was coming. He chose to fight anyway. Camus wrote in the 20th century. The Norse encoded this insight somewhere around the 8th. But the philosophy of Ragnarök was only one layer. The other layer was Baldr. Baldr was the most beloved of all the Norse gods, the god of light, of purity, of the kind of beauty and goodness that exists without effort or striving, that simply is, the way sunlight simply is. Every living thing in the world had sworn an oath not to harm Baldr. Every plant, every animal, every stone, every disease, every poison, every living thing except mistletoe. Mistletoe, too young, too small, too seemingly insignificant to have been thought worth asking, had not sworn the oath. Loki knew this. Loki found a blind god named Höder and guided his hand, placed a dart of mistletoe in it, directed the throw. Baldr fell, dead. The most beloved god, the purest, the most protected. Dead from the most trivial, most accidental, most absurd cause imaginable. A piece of mistletoe, guided by a trickster, thrown by a blind god who did not even know what he was doing. The death of Baldr broke the Norse gods in a way that nothing else did. Not Ragnarök, which they faced with something close to equanimity. Baldr's death. Because Baldr's death was not heroic, not meaningful, not the result of a battle or a choice or a sacrifice. It was stupid. It was the kind of death that the universe produces without explanation, the kind that happens to the best people for the worst reasons. The Norse put this story at the center of their mythology, not hidden, not explained away, right at the center. The beloved god is dead, for no good reason. The universe did not protect him. His goodness did not save him. He is simply gone, and the world continues, darker, colder, moving toward Ragnarök. but continuing. Early Christian missionaries were deeply disturbed by the Baldr myth, not because it was violent, but because it was theologically honest. The Christian God dies and is resurrected. Death is defeated. Goodness is ultimately vindicated. The universe, in the end, is just. Baldr dies and stays dead. Until after Ragnarök, in the world that emerges from the destruction of the Old One, Baldr returns. Not before. Not in time to make a difference. Not in time to fight beside the other gods. After everything is gone. In the new world built on the ruins. The Norse were not telling their children that goodness would be rewarded in this world. They were telling their children something harder and truer. Here is what nobody tells you about the Norse theological system. It worked. Not in the sense that the gods were real. Not in the sense that Valhalla existed. In the sense that the psychological framework it provided, the specific way it prepared Norse people to face death, loss, and uncertainty, and the fundamental indifference of the universe, produced measurably different outcomes than the alternatives. The Norse sagas describe, repeatedly, a specific attitude toward death that historians have struggled to categorize. Not fatalism, the passive acceptance that what will happen, and resistance is pointless. Not denial, the refusal to acknowledge mortality that characterizes many religious frameworks. Something harder to name, a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that death is real and certain and probably coming sooner rather than later, combined with a complete rejection of the idea that this fact should alter how you lived or what you chose to do. The Norse word is hugr. It translates approximately as spirit or courage, but it carries a specific connotation that neither English word captures. Hugr is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act correctly despite fear. It is the recognition that the ocean is genuinely dangerous, the winter genuinely kills, and Ragnarök is genuinely coming, combined with the refusal to let that recognition become paralysis. The gods modeled hugr. Odin, knowing he would be swallowed by a wolf, went to Ragnarök anyway. Thor, knowing he would die from serpent venom, killed the serpent anyway. Freyr, weaponless, knowing he would fall, stood against Surtur anyway. The Norse worshipper did not see gods who were braver than them because they were divine. They saw gods who faced the same problem they faced every time they stepped onto a longship or felt the cold deepen. The knowledge that this might be the thing that kills you, and the decision to do it anyway, regardless of the outcome. Here is the dark twist. When Christianity arrived, it brought a different framework. Death was not the end. Goodness was rewarded. And the Norse, over the course of roughly 200 years, converted, largely peacefully, largely willingly. And with the conversion came the slow erosion of the Norse theological framework. The gods became demons. The myths became superstition. The hugr, the clear-eyed facing of mortality, did not disappear overnight. But it lost its institutional support. It lost the stories. And gradually, the specific psychological preparation for living well in a universe that does not guarantee good outcomes faded into the same void that all things fade into when the people who carry them stop passing them on. In 1942, a French philosopher named Albert Camus was living in Nazi-occupied Paris. The world around him was demonstrating with considerable force that the universe did not protect good people, that courage did not guarantee survival, that the most sophisticated civilization in Europe had produced something monstrous, that the fundamental assumptions of the Enlightenment were not reliable. He was writing a book. The book was called The Myth of Sisyphus. Its central argument was this: life is absurd. The universe does not respond to human values. Death is certain. Meaning is not given. It must be created. And the only authentic response to the absurdity of existence is to face it clearly and to choose to live well anyway. Not because living well will be rewarded, but because the act of choosing is itself the only meaning available. Sisyphus, rolling his boulder, must be imagined happy. Rolling it is itself an act of defiance against meaninglessness. Camus had not read the Norse myths, but what he arrived at in 1942, as was Ragnarök, was Odin, building an army for a battle he knew he would lose. Was Thor walking 14 steps toward death? Was Freyr standing weaponless against the fire giant because standing was what was required? The Norse encoded this insight long ago. Modern psychology rediscovered it, showing that people who face mortality clearly often make better decisions and live more authentically. The Norse were not primitive savages. They were people who understood the world very clearly. They looked at the ocean that killed. They built a theology that told the truth. The gods die. The world ends. Goodness is not always protected, and none of that changes what you are supposed to do. You gather your warriors, you sail into the storm, you fight, not because you will win, because fighting is who you are. The alternative is just dying slowly. The myths are fragments now. Eddas preserved in manuscripts, archaeological evidence interpreted by historians. But the insight is still there. Inside the story of gods who knew they were going to die and built an army anyway. The insight Camus found in 1942. The universe does not owe you a good outcome. Do it anyway.